2019 FDA approval of S-ketamine. So my question to begin is related to Ron Duman and the animal research with ketamine. So for people who really have no history on ketamine, and I want you to fact check this and correct me if I get anything wrong, but ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. It is widely used, very inexpensive. It is partially so widely used because it does not, at least normally, suppress respiration. So you find it being used in military capacities in the field, in veterinary medicine, but it's not a horse tranquilizer per se, which is, I think, what some people believe, but it is used in medicine, and it is one of the World Health Organization's most essential medicines. I mean, this is a pervasive anesthetic. How did Ron or others involved with the animal research even choose that as an intervention?
One of the things that was really striking was when we had made this finding with ketamine and shared the results with Ron, I had the feeling that Ron thought that it was more important than we did. He would say, this is like the most important finding in 50 years. And we would say, what? And so he was really highly motivated to try to understand how ketamine worked. He was one of the pioneers of studying the role of neurotrophic signaling in depression and its treatment. So his laboratory had all the pieces of the story about how nerve growth might be involved in antidepressant treatment. And so he was in some ways uniquely situated to discover this profound structural change. And what was really important about the work is they not only that they described the profound structural change, but they mapped the molecular signaling mechanisms that you alluded to about nerve growth factors engaging a fundamental mechanism for resilience in the brain, these growth factors, as a consequence of chemical communication in the brain. So although ketamine is a glutamate receptor blocker, one of the things that it does is block the excitation of inhibitory cells. That's a really complicated. It's like if you had a brake and then you had another brake that you stepped on to relieve the brake instead of stepping on the gas pedal. That's what ketamine is like in the brain. So ketamine allows more glutamate release to happen in certain circuits of the brain. And you get a pulse, if you will, of glutamate, which is good for the brain, as opposed to sustained high levels of glutamate, which is toxic for the brain. The brain is really sensitive to temporal dynamics. So a pulse of glutamate is good. That stimulates a type of glutamate receptor that triggers the elevation of BDNF levels. It causes a local seepage of BDNF, the nerve growth factor, out of the nerve cells and activates signaling. And then a key way station, and I'm going to get a little technical because I know we're probably going to come back to this point later.
Yeah.
A key way station in the signaling of the nerve growth factor is a protein in nerve cells that's got the name mTOR or mTORC.
Mm-hmm.
And mTOR is an abbreviation for something really complicated, the mechanistic target of rapamycin. And it turns out that if you activate mTOR, then you activate all of the downstream mechanisms that lead to the regrowth and stabilization of these new synaptic connections.
Why autism should be included in these ketamine studies. Here is a study about abnormal mTOR activation in autism. Abnormalities in this pathway have been identified in several syndromes in which autism is highly prevalent. So there are so many studies about this. And ketamine's potential for the treatment of refractory depression and anxiety has been considered one of the most important discoveries. So there is a study from 2013 where they looked at allergy of the brain as a subtype of autism. It's still interesting. So PubMed was searched for articles published since 1995 that reported any association between autism and any one of the following terms like allergy, atopy, brain, corticotropin releasing hormone, cytokines, eczema, food allergy, food intolerance, gene mutation, inflammation, mast cells, mitochondria, neurotensin phenotype, stress subtype, or treatment. The results of this study, so autistic children respond disproportionately to stress and also present with food and skin allergies that involve the mast cells. Brain mast cells are found primarily in the hypothalamus, which participates in the regulation of behavior and language. Corticotropin releasing hormone is secreted from the hypothalamus under stress, and together with neurotensin stimulates brain mast cells that could result in focal brain allergy and neurotoxicity. Neurotensin is significantly increased in serum of children with autism and stimulates mast cell secretion of mitochondrial adenosine triphosphate and DNA, which is increased in these autistic children. These mitochondrial components are misconstrued as innate pathogens, triggering an autoallergic response in the brain. Gene mutations associated with higher risk for autism have been linked to reduction of the phosphatase and tensin homologue, which inhibits the mammalian target of rapamycin, mTOR. These same mutations also lead to mast cell activation and proliferation. Corticotropin releasing hormone, neurotensin, and environmental toxins could further trigger the already activated mTOR, leading to superstimulation of brain mast cells in those areas responsible for autistic symptoms. Preliminary evidence indicates that the flavonoid luteolin is a stronger inhibitor of the mTOR than rapamycin. So what is luteolin? Luteolin is a type of citrus flavonoid that is often found in leaves, rinds, barks, clover blossom, and ragweed pollen. Natural sources include celery, broccoli, green pepper, parsley. All of these, I don't react well to these foods. However, thyme and chamomile tea is a good option, especially since luteolin is good for mast cell stabilization. It stops the degranulation of the mast cells and thus inhibit histamines. So you will less likely have all those symptoms like sneezing, congestion, itchy eyes, brain fog, allergy-like symptoms, and so on. And it may help reducing anxiety. Even interact socially in a much improved way, of course. And it is also in cannabis. Luteolin is categorized as a GABA-A receptor positive allosteric modulator, which increases the activity of the GABA-A receptor protein in the central nervous system. What does that even mean? Basically, GABA is a neurotransmitter in our central nervous system, which can help with sleep, pain, epileptic symptoms, and more, and is a potent mast cell blocker. Conclusion: activating of brain mast cells by allergic, environmental, immune, neurohormonal, stress, and toxic triggers, especially in those areas associated with behavior and language, lead to focal brain allergies and subsequent focal encephalitis. That's interesting. This possibility is more likely in the subgroup of patients with autism susceptibility genes that also involve mast cell activation. Yeah, so my conclusion is avoid stressors. Clean up your diet.
I'm quite interested in animal-based diets. I don't think that it has to be quite that that specific to even get the majority of the benefit. I think the majority of the benefit in a human diet will come from exactly what you are suggesting, eliminating processed food. And
not to be snacking on foods until 10 o'clock at night when you go to bed, and then having something like, cereal or Pop-Tarts, the moment you wake up and to start your day. We know that keeping your glycogen stores full all the time keeps mTOR basically on.
in the liver.
And yes.
Right.
It's the glycogen stores in the liver that primarily control the hormones, but of course you have glycogen stores in your bloodstream.
Exactly.
Very small. You have glycogen stores in your muscles, very large amounts, and some even in your brain tissue. But it's primarily the glycogen stores in your liver, which when they become depleted, shift you from this anabolic state to a catabolic state and turn on this self-repair mechanism, which I do think is really crucial to long-term health.
And I think we totally agree on this point. And I've talked about this with Chris Masterjohn. People listening to the podcast may know that there's mTOR in the liver, mTOR in the muscles, mTOR in the kidneys. There's all these different unique mTOR locales, and there's all these different glycogen locales. And if people are interested, they should listen to the second part of the friendly debate I did with Chris Masterjohn. But in that, we talked about the fact, as you're suggesting, that when glycogen stores become depleted in the liver, we basically go into ketosis. And it's interesting to me that many people on a carnivore diet will experience this, right? They will, or low carbohydrate diets in general. And I'm not convinced that we need to be in ketosis all the time, nor am I convinced that we need to chase ketone levels at the expense of muscle mass and the onset of sarcopenia. I think that's too far. I think what we are doing now is navigating a murky territory. But what's so interesting to me about an animal-based diet is that we can achieve glycogen depletion in the liver. We know that people eating a carnivore diet with a robust amount of protein can have some ketones in their blood from time to time, which would suggest that the liver glycogen is depleted. And as you're suggesting, if there are ketones in the blood from a nutritional standpoint, we are probably activating some autophagy mechanisms. Would you agree?
I do agree. And again, like these other diets that we've talked about, ketosis is not something you should do 24/7, 365 days a year. If you keep mTOR suppressed all the time, you're going to find your white blood cell count dropping, your muscle mass decreasing, and you're just not making proteins that your body needs for your organs to function properly.
Curious, could you just briefly explain the mechanism by which MAO inhibitors improve, or I should say reduce, symptoms of depression? What is actually happening there?
So the way that monoamine oxidase inhibitors work is by inhibiting an enzyme called monoamine oxidase, which is involved in the breakdown, the metabolism of the chemicals norepinephrine and serotonin. And so when you give a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, you raise the level of serotonin and norepinephrine in the synapse, the space between nerve cells, and you increase the stimulation of the receptors for those chemicals. And in that way, they're a little bit like the SSRIs, which instead of preventing the breakdown, they prevent cells from taking up out of the synaptic space these same chemicals. The monoamine oxidase inhibitors also release a bit norepinephrine and serotonin so that they release a little bit and they prevent the uptake. They're actually powerful antidepressant, and they have some side effects and risks that have limited their use in modern clinical practice, but in the era in which I trained, were very commonly prescribed.
What are the main risks and side effects?
As you recall, these monoamine oxidase inhibitors cause a form of release of norepinephrine and serotonin and prevent their breakdown. So anything that, independent of the drug, increased the release of norepinephrine and serotonin had the potential to produce massive increases in norepinephrine and serotonin in the body. And so the problem you get in if you have a massive increase in norepinephrine is you can get big increases in blood pressure that can be life-threatening. And if you get a big increase in serotonin, you can develop something called a serotonin syndrome, which can also be very serious medically. It raises body temperature and creates a stress on the system. And the thing was that the kinds of things that most commonly were a problem is that there's a compound in aged cheese, in wines, in lots of really great things that people really enjoy eating, that has these kinds of foods have a lot of tyramine. And so people would be on a monoamine oxidase inhibitor and have several glasses of Chianti with cheese pizza with lots of cheese on it, aged cheese, and then their blood pressure would go through the roof. And some people would even, have a really bad complication like a stroke or something like that. That happened vanishingly, extraordinarily rarely. And plus, these medications can interact with certain medications. A particular worrisome interaction was they're involved with the metabolism of meperidine or Demerol. And so there was a famous case in New York of someone who was on a monoamine oxidase inhibitor who was then given Demerol in the emergency room and then died from the interaction. So they're really great drugs, but you'd have to be a little careful with them.
So the reason I'm doing some digging on this is, well, there are several reasons. The first is that there's a collection of presentations from a symposium called ESPD 50, which investigated specifically a monoamine oxidase inhibitor called harmine. And the reason they were looking at harmine is because harmine, harmaline, and I believe there's at least one other monoamine oxidase that we've identified exist in the Banisteriopsis caapi vine, which is one of the two typical ingredients in ayahuasca. And the reason that I bring it up is that for a long time, for simplicity, I'll just say Western scientists largely dismissed the vine and ascribed to it one purpose, and that was to render the NN-DMT found in chacruna, or the leaves of this shrub, orally available so that people could have these visionary experiences. Lo and behold, a number of things are true, or appear to be true. One is that the vine itself and these monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which should not be a surprise to you at all, it wouldn't be, have in and of themselves therapeutic effects, including increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. So that's part one. Part two is, and I did not realize this, but you were just discussing aged cheese, wine, and the tyramine content and the contraindications that can come of that. Well, some, again, for simplicity, Western scientists have also dismissed what are sometimes referred to as dietas or preparatory diets related to ayahuasca consumption. And for hundreds and thousands of years, at least so we believe, given some of the carbon dating that has been done in places like Chile, although with different compounds, but sort of outcome related, there are restrictions. There are food restrictions that include cheese and fermented products. I don't know the tyramine content of fermented foods,
Yeah.
but certainly alcohol prohibitions. And these have been, and still are by many people, dismissed as pure superstition. Well, it turns out that jungle biochemists who have had the opportunity to run trial and error for at least a few hundred years may have figured out a few things.
So these are the foods that should be avoided if you work with a MAOI. So meat that is not fresh, especially unfresh liver. Fresh meat and fresh liver are safe. Bologna, pepperoni, salami, corned beef, sausage, hot dogs, and cured meats. Smoked, fermented, pickled, and otherwise aged or dried fish. Any fish that is not fresh. Fermented tofu, fermented bean curd, fermented soybean paste, miso soup, soy sauce, teriyaki sauce, cheeses, especially aged cheeses, protein extracts, liquid or powdered protein, dietary supplements, canned soups, or soups made with protein extracts or bouillon, gravies and foods made with meat extracts, dried egg whites, defatted peanut flour, brewer's yeast, yeast vitamin supplements, yeast extracts, foods with yeast in ingredients, sourdough bread, shrimp paste, sauerkraut, pickled foods. And then you have the whole list of pharmaceutical drugs that should not be combined with any MAOIs.